Chapter 9. The Kindness of Strangers. The yard of Fort Gallant was a mire of mud. A cold, persistent drizzle had turned the packed earth into a slurry that clung to boots and spirits alike. The air was a thick soup of wet wool, antiseptic, and a sour tang of unwashed fear. Into this purgatory they emerged, the dull gleam of their new armor, an obscene contrast to the ragged civilians who watched them pass with hollow eyes. At the heart of the largest cluster of refugees, a man stood precariously on an overturned ration crate. His lab coat, stained and torn, flapped around a skeletal frame. His frantic, bushy eyebrows danced above wild eyes as his voice, sharp with hysteria, sliced through the low hum of despair. "They knew!" he shrieked, a trembling, accusatory finger jabbing towards the handful of remaining SDF soldiers, a gesture that swept over the newly arrived squad. "Military intelligence. I was there. They studied the swarm for years, and what did they learn? That its hive mind is stronger on this damned planet. While they grew fat in their heated barracks, your family starved. They stockpiled weapons and left your children to be devoured. They are fools, marching you to your graves." A venomous murmur coiled through the crowd. Gaunt faces turned, and grief curdled into resentment. The man's words were a lit match tossed onto a field of dry powder. "Look at them!" he screeched, his voice cracking as he pointed directly at Morale. "Fresh armor, full bellies. Gorging on the food meant for your babies." Morale's brow furrowed, his expression one of pure, earnest confusion. His gaze shifted from the snarling faces to his own squad. "Babies are the best food," he rumbled, the statement, a simple, absolute truth in his Vesk mind, a compliment to the young's vitality. The crowd heard a monstrous confession. A woman choked back a sob. A man spat into the mud. The murmur became a roar. Eve took a half-step back. The individual faces of the crowd blurred, their angry shouts melting into a single, grating frequency that scraped at the damaged edges of her logic processors. It was a sound she recognized from the swarm, a unified hostility. Infestation! The word pulsed in her core programming, a direct command now at war with her primary function. These are guests, distressed guests. But the sound they made was a discordant hum, the sound of the hive. The conflict was a recursive error, a logical cascade threatening total system failure. She had to disengage. The crowd surged. Spark was swallowed by the wave, knocked from his feet. A boot slammed into his ribs and he curled into a tight ball, his voice a pathetic peep. "I don't eat much. I'm small." Seeing the Isoki go down was like a switch flipping in Morale's brain. The loud, seething mass had threatened his small, strange brood. A snarl tore from his throat. He lunged, his armored gauntlet catching the nearest man squarely on the jaw. The sound was a wet, definitive crunch. The man crumpled bonelessly into the mire. The sharp crack of a rifle shot silenced the mob. On the ramp of a second-story container, the lieutenant stood, a smoking rifle leveled over their heads. "Disperse! Now!" he bellowed, his voice raw with an authority born of exhaustion. The crowd dissolved, their brief rage evaporating back into a more familiar, formless fear. Morale's fist remained clenched, knuckles white against his darker scales. He faced the lieutenant, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Angry," he stated, as if identifying a physical condition. "I can see that," the lieutenant grunted, lowering his weapon. "Can't handle a few starving civilians? Get up! The commandant wants you." The command container had been scrubbed clean, but the ghost of blood and antiseptic still clung to the air. Commandant Haji Nahiriji stood over a map table, her weight resting on a new leg, a gleaming, unpainted prosthetic that terminated in a functional three-toed stabilizer. Her limp was a subtle, sharp declaration of will. Spark's eyes immediately locked under the complex articulation of the knee joint, his tinkerer's brain cataloging the design with a covetous gleam. Morale's anger, however, vanished for a different reason. Standing beside the commandant was another Vesk, scales the same dusty green as his own, his armor bearing the faded insignia of the 5th Battalion. "This is Targan Vokar," Nahiriji said, her voice flat. "Only other one from the 5th we found. He's with you." She glanced at Targan. Seems he didn't get on with the boys from the 4th. Commandant, Spark blurted out, unable to restrain himself, his gaze still fixed on her leg. Is that a Mark IV actuator or a custom? It cost more than your life is worth, rat, Nahiriji snapped, her eyes flashing with banked fire. Now focus on the map before yours is worthless, too. Spark flinched, his eyes darting to the topographical map on the table. It was almost entirely consumed by a crimson tide of pulsing swarm icons. A handful of scattered blue sparks near the coast was all that remained of their forces. Why are there so many red dots? He squeaked. Nahiriji's voice cracked. Because we have lost, you idiot. She took a sharp, steadying breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the table's edge. When she spoke again, her voice was glacial. President Daglan agrees. Suskelon is a lost cause. The evacuation order has been given. We're pulling out to Reos. It's the last functioning spaceport accessible to us. She straightened, her gaze a physical weight. The civilians leave first. You are their rear guard. Your squad will be the last vehicle out of this scrap heap. Understood? Their ride was a tracked personnel carrier, a brutal slab of angled armor that its crew had nicknamed the Pig. A massive, twin-barreled flak cannon sat atop it like a crown. Spark made a hopeful move for the driver's hatch, but was waved off by a middle-aged man in greasy overalls, who looked as though he'd been welded into the seat. Positions, the lieutenant barked. Marol and Targan, after a gruff, clicked exchange in Vesk, clambered up to the gunners' nests. Eve, with a seamless motion, took her place behind a heavy machine gun. Jaren, his face a pale mask, disappeared into the cold dark of the vehicle's hold. He still felt the ghost of the mantis's blade in his ribs, a phantom ache no serum could fully erase. As civilians were herded onto 3 large transport buses, Nahiriji's voice boomed from a lead vehicle's loudspeakers. We are going to Rios. We will be there by nightfall. The port is open. The small motorcade lurched into motion, trailing the last hopes of Suskelon. 15 minutes down the road, the convoy halted. They looked back. In the distance, a series of concussive blasts ripped Fort Gallant apart, sending a greasy plume of black smoke into the sky. The journey resumed. Bored, Spark began swiveling the flak cannon, making soft pew-pew noises. The 2 Vesk had fallen into a low, rumbling conversation, their guttural laughter a stark contrast to the grim silence around them. Eve, tuning out the boisterous Vesk, scanned the sky. Her optical sensors registered a flicker, a single, peculiar green dot, impossibly high. Attention valued. Airborne threat detected. Pest. Recommend immediate. She never finished. The dot resolved itself with terrifying speed. It was a torpedo-shaped craft the size of a bus, its hull an iridescent organic material. At its rear, long tentacles pulsed, squeezing a core of sickly light that lanced forward through the vessel's body, coalesced at its tip, and spat downward in a silent, searing beam. The ray missed the carrier, but struck close to the driver's cockpit. The armored glass flash vaporized into incandescent sand. The man inside let out a single, strangled scream as a cloud of viridian vapor consumed him. The Pig, driverless, veered sharply toward a ditch. Spark launched himself over the cockpit's railing, a sizzle of pain shooting up his leg as his fur brushed the acid-eaten metal. He shoved the driver's smoking body out of the seat, where it dropped to the floor with a wet thud. His paws found the controls, and he slammed the accelerator, wrestling the heavy vehicle back onto the road. The motion threw Jaren from his bunk. He emerged onto the deck just as the Vesk opened fire. Targan's flak cannon thundered, peppering the sky with shrapnel. Eve gripped her machine gun, its analog controls no challenge, but the Pig's violent lurching rendered her targeting subroutines useless. Every calculated firing solution was made obsolete the instant Spark swerved. Forced to rely on clumsy manual prediction, the gun bucked in her hands, spitting a wild stream of tracers far wide of the mark. Morale was jabbing his thumb at the trigger guard, searching for a non-existent activation button. The enemy craft reappeared through the flak clouds and fired again. The beam went wide, but acid rained down on the deck. Jaren and the Vesks cried out as corrosive droplets hissed against their armor. "Left! Hard left!" Jaren bellowed. Spark had slammed the cockpit's blast shield shut and was driving blind, guided only by the shouts. A crackle came over the comms, a voice calm and clear. "Fourth actual, this is Sky Fury. Air support inbound, 15 seconds. As if emboldened, their own fire found its mark. Eve, compensating for the lurching vehicle, raked a stream of fire across the alien craft's flank. At the same moment, one of Targon's flak shells burst directly in its path. The organic ship faltered. It began to disengage, just as brilliant streams of light shot past it from the horizon. One of the pulses connected. The craft vanished in a silent confetti of green light. Seconds later, 3 SDF fighters screamed overhead, their passage followed by a deafening sonic boom. Spark opened the blast shields. Ahead, the civilian buses had stopped, their windows crowded with pale faces. He glanced down at the pilot's body. A low moan escaped the man's lips. He wasn't dead. When the lieutenant's vehicle pulled alongside, the wounded pilot was transferred. "Well defended midnight," he called out, a rare note of respect in his voice. "Get back in formation." As they moved on, Moreau took out his combat knife and scratched a name into his machine gun mount. "Buttonless bastard." Jaren, irritated by the Vesk's renewed laughter, retreated once more into the hold. They reached the outskirts of Reyes as the last of the light failed. Jaren watched the city silhouette harden against the sky. It wasn't a beacon, but a tomb. The streets were clogged with stalled vehicles, many with doors left wide open. A child's plush toy lay in a snowdrift, its button eyes staring blankly at nothing. The only sound was the wind, howling between the dark buildings. "Everybody out!" Nahiriji's voice commanded over the comms, harsh and metallic. "We walk from here!" The moment their boots hit the pavement, the scale of the exodus became real. They were just a part of a slow, shuffling column of people moving through the dark streets. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and wet clothing. To Jaren, it was a familiar scent, but never on this scale, never from the people he was supposed to protect. A cold rigidity crept into his posture, his jaw tightened until it ached. For Spark, the scene fractured. Too many shuffling bodies, their faces blurring into a single, indistinct mass. The plaza felt vast and exposed, offering no cover from the dark, silent buildings that seemed to lean in and press down on him. His hand darted into a pouch, seeking the familiar steel of a hydrospanner. His fingers found it and began a rapid, complex pattern of adjustments, a small, mechanical ritual to impose order on the chaos. They were herded toward the spaceport, into a sprawling, makeshift city of tents and shipping containers that stretched out under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. The lights bleached the color from everything, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed with the movement of the crowd. Finally, an exhausted SDF officer directed them to a designated tent in the military section, a small pocket of relative order in a sea of pandemonium. Nahiriji found them there minutes later, her new leg making a soft, rhythmic click on the frozen ground as she entered. She looked as though she hadn't slept in a week. "The evacuation is proceeding," she said, her voice devoid of preamble or emotion. "But we have a loose end. A retrieval op for a Shuran priest of Hylax failed a few days ago. The name is Zelan, holed up in a temple about 100 miles north." She handed Eve a data slate. "The coordinates. The swarm won't reach the Dethomar River for 2 days. This should be straightforward. Consider it a holiday in the country." Jaren's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. A Shuran. After Calavar, after everything, they were sending him to rescue one of them. He said nothing, but the silence was a physical force. "We go now?" Moreau asked, hefting his weapon. "You go in the morning," Nahiriji said, turning to leave. "Get some rest." They slept, or tried to the sound of starships arriving and departing, a steady, heartbreaking rhythm of an escape that did not yet include them. The light that greeted them the next morning was thin and gray, filtering through a low-hanging sky that promised more snow. The lieutenant's offering was a wheeled cargo truck, its unarmored cab and open flatbed a significant downgrade from the Pig. In the cab, Spark's hands moved over the controls with ease, but his eyes kept flicking to Jaren. He sat rigid in the passenger seat, his rifle across his lap, scanning the landscape. A particularly vicious bump sent a jolt through the cab, and Jaren's hand instinctively went to his ribs, a sharp hiss of breath escaping through his teeth. "See anything?" Spark asked, his voice small in the quiet cab. "Just ghosts," Jaren replied without turning his head. The road unwound through a valley of skeletal, snow-dusted wrecks. An endless funeral procession on the wind-swept flatbed behind them. A conversation had started, loud enough to be heard over the engine's drone. "No, no," Targan rumbled. "You have to get the pike red hot, plunge it straight through the thorax. It sears the meat, seals in the juices." Morale shook his head, a motion of profound disagreement. "Amateur! You'll burn the outside, and leave the inside raw. Slow roasting over a low flame. That is the only way. The carapace turns brittle. You peel it off like a shell." "A low flame?" Targan scoffed. "We are soldiers, not chefs. Who has time for a low flame?" He keyed his comm. "Spark, this pike, what is its thermal tolerance? Can I get it hot enough for a proper sear without compromising the structural integrity?" Spark's voice crackled back, laced with distraction. "It's a standard blast steel composite. Targan, it's not a cooking utensil. I wouldn't recommend heating it to—" He was cut off by Eve's calm, clear tone over the channel. "The internal fluids of most swarm bioforms are highly acidic. Unsanctioned ingestion would result in severe gastrointestinal perforation. Furthermore, the chitin contains a potent neurotoxin that remains viable unless heated to a core temperature of 827 degrees Kelvin for a minimum of 180 seconds. A profound silence fell over the flatbed. Morole and Targan stared at each other. "You have ruined bug roasting," Morole said finally, his voice flat with accusation. "My function is to provide accurate, relevant data," Eve replied. Up front, Jaren allowed himself a grim, fleeting smile. "Quiet," he said, his voice a low command. "Brakes! Slow!" Spark eased his foot onto the pedal, the truck slowing. Ahead, where the valley curved, a man was stumbling toward them. One hand clutched his stomach, the other was raised in a gesture of surrender. A corpse lay on the road a few yards behind him. Eve and Morale dropped from the truck, weapons ready. As they approached, Morale's eyes narrowed. On the man's neck, just peeking from his collar, was the crude, black ink of a scorpion tattoo. The crude ink snagged on a memory, dragging it into the light. Mercenaries at the fort, trading stories over lukewarm rations. They spoke of Suskillian's prisons, brutal even before the swarm. But the Scorpion Gang, they'd spoken of them with a mix of disgust and morbid admiration, had turned the prisons into their own private hunting grounds, breaking fingers for a crust of bread or collecting debts with casual cruelty. These weren't just scavengers, they were hyenas that enjoyed the kill. "Ambush!" Morole bellowed. The man's pretense dropped. He snarled and drew a stun baton as another man leaped up from behind a wrecked car. They never had a chance. Morale met the first man's charge with the point of his pike, punching the polearm through his chest with a sickening thud. Before Eve could acquire a target, Targan had stepped forward and neatly impaled the second attacker. From the truck's mirror, Jaren saw two more figures who had been rising from cover, stop, stare, and then flee into the hills. Morale planted a boot on the dead man's chest for leverage and wrenched his pike free with a wet sucking sound. Without a flicker of emotion, he wiped the blade on the man's tunic before turning to the other body. In the truck's cab, Jaren watched the scene unfold in the side mirror, a small nod acknowledging the brutal efficiency. Beside him, Spark's knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead as if he could unsee what was reflected in the glass. Eve watched the unceremonious cleanup. A new logical sequence initiated. Data point, Vesk combat efficiency. Threat neutralized in 1.8 seconds. Juxtapose against tactical data from the deceased. Subject condition, malnourished. Armament, low charge stun baton. Pre-existing trauma, multiple poorly healed lacerations. Analysis, threat level, negligible. Tactics, clumsy. Status, terminated. Casualties of a different, more chronic war. The squad mounted the truck in a silence heavier than before. The engine droned. For an hour, the road offered nothing but the same repeating vista of wrecked vehicles and snow-dusted hills. The monotony settled like a shroud, until Spark finally pointed a finger ahead. "Look!" At a desolate fueling station, a single sedan sat by the cell chargers. Its hazard lights were blinking feebly. The windows were so fogged from the inside, it was impossible to see in. As Sparks slowed, Eve's head tilted. "Guest assistance may be required," she stated. Then her tone lost its placid quality. "Correction. An infestation is present. I am detecting skittering movements on the station's roof, in proximity to the civilians." Jaren peered through the windscreen. Eve was right. Several small, ant-like swarm horrors were crawling on the canopy directly above the car. A trap. Sparks stopped the truck. He looked at the sedan, at the faint suggestion of a family huddled inside, then at the monsters waiting above. He sighed. His gaze flickered to the rearview mirror. On the flatbed, the two Vesk stood like stone gargoyles, weapons ready. Between them, Eve's form was a silent statue. The thought struck him then. They were the monsters, the scary things you sent into the dark. And he was the one driving them. It wasn't bravery. It was the simple weight of the steering wheel in his paws. With a lurch, he turned the wheel, guiding their truck off the road. He drove them toward the trap.